Catching criminals is no easy job.
Making it to arrest you.
But it's even harder when the criminal is a cop turned bad.
He liked having power and authority and status and a uniform.
When the police officers who were sworn to protect us turned to rape.
She was actually meeting a monster.
Murder.
What happened in those minutes or moments or seconds where he chose to go and get a weapon?
Robbery.
He knows where the money is, he knows where the drugs are.
And even blackmail and poisoning. All just to get what they want. In this series, I'm enlisting the help of 3 experts.
That man should stay behind bars for the rest of his life.
2 senior officers who've put hundreds of offenders behind bars.
He was in such a lofty position that he thought he was untouchable.
And a psychologist who can analyse the criminal mind.
He's a narcissist. He doesn't feel remorse.
In this series, I'll be investigating why some cops put themselves on the wrong side of the law, abuse their power, and commit horrific crimes. This is a story of a police officer who was so well thought of, he was trusted to guard the royal family. Hidden from public view, this royal protection officer led a double life, entangled in a world of firearms and illicit encounters with sex workers. And his loving wife had no idea what was going on, until she got in the way. What follows is a shocking tale which ends in the ultimate crime. On the afternoon of the 10th of January 1997, Patricia Coulton went to work as normal at a care home in Berkshire. Aged 52, with 2 grown-up children, Patricia was a trusted care worker at the Linwood Nursing Home in Sunningdale. Meanwhile, her husband, Michael Coulton, was on shift guarding the royal family here at one of the most famous buildings in the country, Buckingham Palace. And that's where I'm meeting Caroline Kerr, a journalist who covered this case. What do we know happened on January 10th?
Patricia was a care assistant. She worked locally and was going in to do a late shift. What we know about her day is that she went to a travel agent's on the way and she booked a 2-week holiday, and her colleague said that she was in very good humour that day because she was quite excited about the holiday.
So on that night, Patricia just leaves work from the nursing home as normal?
Yeah, she leaves at about 10 o'clock, which is her usual time, and gets into her car, and a friend sees her getting into the car, but within about a minute the car cuts out. Meanwhile,
on that cold January night, Michael Coulton finished his shift at the Royal Palace and went home. By 11:15 p.m. there was no sign of his wife, so he raised the alarm and called the police. Former Detective Chief Superintendent Sue Hill has led investigations into many serious crimes and has agreed to help me unravel what happened after the police went looking for Patricia Coulton.
Now, in this case, the husband is reported her missing. You know, he's shocked, he's devastated, he's grieving.
But it didn't take long for Patricia to be discovered, as she hadn't made it far from the care home. So, when was she actually found?
So she was found the next day. A dog walker found her. She was still in the vehicle, blood all over her, beaten, stabbed, and her body was halfway out of the vehicle. Just a horrendous scene.
Police rushed to the crime scene. When the police arrive at the scene and they find what they find, what do they think's happened?
I think initially they just don't know. She was stabbed 15 times in the car, and some people locally heard screams, but they thought it was foxes. So at that point, she is being murdered and nobody comes to her rescue. It's a very, very violent attack, but at this point, they don't know why it's occurred.
Detectives started their methodical investigation by locking down the area and searching for vital clues. So at that stage, what would you be looking for?
First of all, you secure the forensics, make sure nothing's taken into the scene, nothing's taken away. That is your crime scene. And then what you do, you need witnesses. Did anyone know anything? Despite what you see in the media, random murders and attacks on women are very, very rare. So you'd be looking at the neighbours, maybe talk to work colleagues, and then you'd start building a picture and piecing together the jigsaw. We need to find a motive. You know, why would anyone want to kill Patricia? Why?
As police secured the scene, they began sifting evidence and speaking to witnesses. The people at the care home had started to try and process their loss.
It's dreadful, awful shock. She was lovely. All I can say is I didn't know her closely. I knew her as a carer, and as far as the carers are concerned, they're all lovely.
Whilst those who knew Patricia at work were being spoken to, other detectives had the task of speaking to her now widowed husband, Michael. So, what do we know about Michael Coulton?
Well, Michael Coulton, he joined the Met Police in the 70s. Just a straightforward response driver when he joined, just an everyday kind of guy. He was married and he had 2 children, and his wife Patricia, they appeared to all intents and purposes a happily married couple.
Isn't it true, though, that he had quite a high-end job?
He was deployed on royalty protection. He would stand outside the palace, and he would be outside Windsor Castle. So basically, he would have been armed. He'd be on fixed points, static points, and making sure he's protecting royalty, diplomats, you know, politicians.
To me, that sounds quite prestigious. You must have to go through some sort of training to carry a gun, you know?
Well, to carry a gun, you have to go through a selection process, psychometric testing. You know, they just don't issue a firearm to everyone. So he would have been vetted, he would have been selected, he'd been gone through an interview process to make sure that he's got the right attributes to be able to carry a gun and be physically fit and actually have the authority and the ability to protect our royal family.
So, an all-round, good cop, respected?
Yes.
Michael Coulton, a devoted officer who took great pride in his work, faced a significant test early in his police career.
I think it's interesting with Michael Coulton that in 1976 he was at Notting Hill Carnival and he got badly stabbed. And he was off sick for 12 months.
It was during this sick leave that the cracks started to show in his marriage to Patricia. And by the early 1980s, it seemed Coulton was beginning to find solace elsewhere. So we know there's issues in his marriage. What happens after that?
He was having an affair with a next-door neighbour, and he even talked to the next-door neighbour about how he was in this unhappy relationship with his wife Patricia, and how sex was boring, how he didn't want to be with her. And really, poor Patricia was completely blindsided. She had no idea. She thought she was happily married, in a nice relationship, and eventually he split up with Patricia.
In 1983, the couple separated and divorced. But very unusually, they came back together again just 3 years later. To help me understand their relationship dynamic, I've come to speak to psychologist Serena Simmons.
When you see men rebound and keep going back to a previous partner, I think how we kind of try and make sense of that is to think about it from an attachment perspective. So men like him often need that secure attachment figure, and they don't feel very strong without them. So just like a baby when they're growing up, they need to keep knowing that their mum's there and kind of keep looking back to know that they have that secure attachment. So she served a purpose. Often men who have those multiple affairs are only good at having the affair, as in they still need a woman at home to make them feel good on a daily basis. But when that's gone, their attachment kind of crumbles. They don't have this secure figure anymore, which renders them quite weak.
Despite the Coultons reuniting in 1986, a shocking revelation emerged. Michael had laid bare his dark thoughts about Patricia to the woman he was having an affair with.
So he's having an affair with a neighbour. Now, this neighbour recalls that he used to say things to her about Patricia, his wife, how he wished that he could drown her in the bath, or he had visions of electrocuting her, or talking about cutting her brakes. So already he was talking about how to get rid of his wife.
So knowing all what the neighbour knows, she knows that the wife's in danger.
Well, you would have thought so. However, I imagine when they're in that kind of extramarital relationship, she's probably thinking he's just saying that as bravado because he wanted to carry on with the relationship with her, making that more important than what it was.
Although that first affair was in the 1980s and Michael and Patricia did get back together and eventually remarry in 1995, I couldn't help thinking that those conversations about killing his wife had to mean something.
He was obviously taking time to think about what he could do to her to get rid of her, and he verbalised that to someone. I think he verbalised that to someone that he felt safe with, and that's why he said it. So that was like a little bit of leakage on his part. He was letting something go there.
Do you think she took it like with a pinch of salt, what he was saying about what he was doing to his wife, rather than take him seriously?
So I don't think we ever know that someone actually is serious, but that should be a red flag to anyone. If someone is talking about killing a partner, that's not something that you say in jest, and certainly if you've been doing it on repeat, that would be a red flag for anyone, I think.
But at this stage in the investigation, all detectives knew was that Patricia Coulton had been killed in a frenzied knife attack. They had no concrete evidence which might lead them to the identity of her killer. Michael Coulton was a police officer trusted to guard the royal family. But just what did happen to his wife Patricia after he left his shift at Buckingham Palace on January the 10th, 1997?
Straightforward. Awful shock. She was lovely. All I can say is I didn't know her closely. I knew her as a carer.
Patricia's body was discovered lying across the doorway of her car, left lifeless in the grounds of the care home where she worked in Sunningdale, Berkshire.
She was stabbed 15 times in the car, and some people locally heard screams. There's no evidence of any kind of sexual assault, there's no evidence of any robbery. It's a very, very violent attack, but at this point, they don't know why it's occurred.
5 days after Patricia's murder, on January the 15th, 1997, police decided to revisit those closest to her, including her husband, Michael Coulton, a Metropolitan Police Royal Protection Officer. To help me understand the workings of a murder investigation, I've come to see Howard Groves, a former Met detective with decades of experience in serious crime cases.
They go and visit him at home. He appears to be the distraught husband. Even though he's treated as a victim and he would have had the support of a family liaison officer, they would have gone and searched his home. That's just standard procedure. They carried out the search and they recovered numerous prohibited weapons. For instance, there was a shotgun that had been given to him by Princess Alexandra's chauffeur. He had shortened the barrel of that, and he'd actually made it what we describe as a .38 handgun. These are all prohibited items, and he would have known that.
Clearly unnerved by the search of his home by police colleagues, Coulton began behaving erratically.
Michael Coulton panicked as he was arrested during what was supposed to have been just a routine search. He grabbed this pump-action shotgun and threatened the arresting officer.
What would happen in that situation?
Those officers would have just turned up conducting inquiries in relation to the murder of his wife, so they wouldn't have had firearms. So they would have been surprised, one, by the firearms being on open display, and two, him then threatening them with it.
I wanted to know what kind of man would keep so many illegal firearms at his home.
He kept weapons because it gave him a sense of authority. Also, quite confusingly, probably safety. He felt safe for having those. And I don't mean that in the way that someone might keep a firearm in their home for safety to protect himself, but he wanted to again feel powerful and safe because he was the most important person in his life. He did everything because of his own egocentricity. So he wanted to feel powerful, he wanted to feel in control, he wanted to know that no one could hurt him. And I think that that's exhibited in the fact that when his home was actually searched, he did panic and he tried to hide the firearms and particularly paperwork in the boot of his car. And when it came close to people realising that those things were there, he grabbed the shotgun and started to threaten one of the officers that was searching the property.
On the 17th of January 1997, just 7 days after his wife's murder, Michael Coulton is suspended from duty by the Metropolitan Police after admitting 4 firearms offences.
Royal Protection Squad policeman Michael Coulton, whose wife Pat was murdered a week ago, appeared before magistrates in Reading today on firearms charges.
He was released on conditional bail a few days later, on the 24th of January 1997. His wife's dead, so surely for a copper that's like red flags here. You know, he's got all these guns he's not supposed to have, and we just told him his wife's dead and he's threatening police.
Oh, totally. And to me, he's kind of lost the plot. However, all well and good, you can think he's a wrong un, he's done it, but actually there was no evidence. There was no association. He's, at that stage, got no forensic evidence, no witnesses. He was at home, OK, he's got firearms illegally, but that does not make him a murderer, because the method was stabbing and those firearms weren't related to the murder.
Meanwhile, at the care home in Sunningdale where Patricia worked and her body was found, the search was still on for the weapon that was used to murder her.
They would have done a fine tooth comb search of the area to see if they could have retrieved the weapon. That wasn't found. They did take samples of soil. They found a footmark in the snow, so that was photographed, that was lifted and taken away. And those things are kept to see what is subsequently found to support that.
As police forensics continued to work the scene, other officers canvassed the area in the hope they might start to get answers.
We're investigating an incident which took place here in this area last week.
The line of inquiry would be, was it a robbery? But it was obvious to them that her handbag was still there, her phone was there, her rape alarm was still there. So that would create a dilemma for the officers as to, so why was she attacked? What was the motive? So the initial process would be for the police to do a public appeal because they had no idea as to who killed her and the motive. So the press appeal would have been the normal course of action.
I am determined, as is Thames Valley Police, that we will do all we can to catch the killer of Pat Coulton in such tragic circumstances so that the old people in this home can start to live their lives without the fear that hangs over them at the moment.
Their hard work finally paid off when a witness came forward to tell the police they'd seen a blue Morris Ital car driving from the murder scene at the time of the killing. As police pressed on probing everyone in Patricia's circle, a woman came forward with even more startling revelations about royal cop Michael Coulton.
Diana Bridges, who was his former neighbour, he went to visit her the day after Patricia's death and asked her not to speak to the police. And it had the opposite effect on her. It made her feel obviously quite suspicious of him. And she went to the police. And that was the first time, I think, that they had an insight into his true character.
Diana described Coulton as being obsessed with her.
He starts becoming a bit stalkerish and obsessing over her. And although they didn't have a relationship, he was following her, he was watching her, and she felt really uncomfortable. And he ended up stealing some photographs of her. He just was acting really weirdly and obsessive about her.
This behaviour isn't what you would expect from someone who carries a gun and is entrusted to guard and protect royalty. So what was going on in Coulton's head?
I think that Diana was clearly aware of the kind of character that he was. He was essentially stalking her, and she asked him very clearly to not have anything to do with her. So when his wife died, I think it was very easy for her to put 2 and 2 together because she knew his character, and so she felt compelled to stand up and go forward and tell the police what she knew. And that was very brave on her part, because really she may not have been able to make any distinct links, but there was enough for her to feel unsure. There was enough for her to want to call this person out and draw attention to him and draw attention to the character that he had.
A picture was building of Coulton's secret life, but police still had no evidence. Not until they discovered the car that witnesses had placed at Patricia's murder scene.
So during the course of the police inquiries, they find a burnt-out blue Morris Ital. Now, initially, those officers would have done inquiries based on the numbers in the engine and identified it as belonging to somebody called P. Johnson. So that would not have had any information to link it to Coulton at that point.
Undeterred, police pressed on with further testing. Detailed forensics were done on the car to see if there was any DNA or mineral traces connecting the vehicle with the murder scene. So what happened next in the investigation?
There was soil on that car, in that vehicle, that was associated at the scene of Patricia's death.
Right.
So then you've got a forensic link. So whoever was driving that Morris is a very good suspect.
Paul Johnston was the name given as a registered keeper of the vehicle, but police had no luck tracing him, leaving it as a dead end for detectives. So now, the focus of the investigation moved back into Coulton's private life, and it was soon discovered that he had been using massage parlours and seeing sex workers on a regular basis.
As a result of the difficulties in his relationship, he decided that he would have a relationship with sex workers that would visit his address when his wife was at work. So there was an awful lot that was going on. He was living a chaotic and a really strange life.
I think seeing sex workers was safe for him. I don't think in reality he was probably very confident, front-facing. So I think seeking relationships essentially with sex workers was a safe bet for him. It meant that he could pay for their services, they had to spend time with him, because we know that he wasn't that confident in actually seeking the genuine attention of people.
So, Coulton, a police officer who guarded Buckingham Palace, was visiting sex workers. And it turns out one of these women had a key piece of information that would crack this case wide open. Michael Coulton was leading a double life, sleeping with sex workers and keeping illegal firearms in his home. But he had a much bigger secret, and police were closing in. A burnt-out car had been discovered that witnesses placed at the scene of his wife Patricia Coulton's murder on the 10th of January 1997.
The breakthrough moment would have been the recovery of that vehicle, and therefore the next part of the investigation would be a forensic search of that vehicle. And during the forensication, they identified that there was soil inside the vehicle, which was similar to that in the orchard where Patricia had been killed. The vehicle was registered in a completely different name.
The name the burnt-out car was registered in was Paul Johnston. By the 27th of February 1997, 318 witness statements had been taken, and a total of 1,823 separate police inquiries. But despite their best efforts, a team of 28 officers and civilian police staff involved in the hunt for Patricia's killer could find no trace of Johnston. The investigation moved forward with their next best lead, Coulton's personal life. They discovered he had a close relationship with a sex worker known as Sherry.
He bought a car and kept it in a lockup and bought it under an alias so that it wouldn't be traced to him.
Coulton was making use of his extensive police knowledge to make sure he covered his tracks.
And he also wanted to be careful that no documentation came to his home. And he persuaded Sherry to allow him to use her address for that car documentation to come through to. And he told her some cock-a-bull story about it being police undercover work.
And guess which name Coulton gave on the paperwork for the car he kept at Sherry's address? Yep, Paul Johnston, the owner of the Morris Ital spotted leaving the scene of Patricia Coulton's murder. Right, so obviously this is a burnt-out car.
No, this vehicle was registered in another name, but actually he was the owner of this vehicle. It was just giving false details.
But how hard is it, though, if you find a burnt-out car, to forensically examine it and get all the details?
There are certain details in the engine block that they will be able to identify the serial number, and from that they can then trace the vehicle back to the owners or previous owners. So that's quite straightforward. The question is why was the vehicle burnt out in the first place? Because that would have been set alight somewhere. Somebody would have told police that there's a vehicle on fire. And initially they probably wouldn't know there was anything sinister with it. It's not until events that unfold later on that they would have then put this vehicle to be involved with him later on.
But Coulton has burnt that out thinking that covers me tracks.
Yeah, because when he gets to the scene in this vehicle and he leaves, if for some reason someone was walking their dog or doing something at that time of the morning and saw the vehicle and gave a description or a registration mark of the vehicle, it wouldn't come back to him. So he was thinking ahead. He was planning, and he then also makes sure he registered it in another person's name. So he was calculating in what he was doing. He was planning, and actually everything worked up to the point where she was killed, and then for the police officers to then investigate it and then prove he was the person involved.
This was the evidence police were looking for. The car that Coulton owned was seen at the site of his wife's murder. And what's more, when police searched his home, they discovered yet more damning evidence. Then how would they know that Coulton was driving that car?
Because they found a pair of shoes, and on the shoes there was soil that matched the soil at the scene of the murder.
So he's kept the shoes that he wore when he murdered his wife?
Yeah, how ridiculous, schoolboy error.
He's not the brightest spark, is he?
Not really, keeping the shoes with the soil on from the crime scene. Yeah, he hasn't thought that one through.
On the 21st of April 1997, police arrested Michael Coulton for the murder of his wife, Patricia. The police had a growing pile of evidence against him. But there's one thing confusing me. On the night of Patricia's murder, how did Coulton know her car was going to break down?
This isn't that unusual because Patricia's experienced this on 2 previous occasions. And on both of those occasions, miraculously, her husband seems to be almost round the corner and is able to come very, very fast and fix the car.
So why has the car broke down before then?
What police came to realise was that he had constructed a remote-controlled device that could cut out the engine.
It was this black box which was the key to proving that Coulton was a killer. A remote control device found by police when they searched the garage of his family home in Woking. At first they couldn't work out what it was.
I was just sat looking at it one day together with a diagram of the car's wiring, and it occurred to me that you may be able to plug the plug from the device into the car itself and thereby cause the thing to stop.
And Michael Coulton's explanation of this remote control is it's used for a toy clam.
I'm sure the police must have tested it to see what it was for.
And then they tested it and knew he was using that to stall the vehicle.
Unbelievable. Unbelievable. Police tests reveal that the remote device was only able to turn things off, and the true use of the device was extremely devious.
We found the device itself had a range of only about 200 yards, but stood at the roadside. Once you operated the switch on the remote control device in your hand, that caused the switch under the bonnet of the car to operate, and the car then stopped about, well, a matter of hundreds of yards along the road.
Detectives realised that the 2 previous times Patricia's car had cut out weren't by chance. None of it was.
Their belief is that he'd been trying this out on the 2 previous occasions, but on this occasion it sparked the murder. So
he was obviously maybe doing dummy runs to see how far he needed to be away from the car so he could use the remote to see if it worked before. And once he knew it worked, he knew the right spot to do it, and then
it could be that. It could be that on one occasion when it happened before, she was on the phone to her son when he appeared on the scene. So it could be that scuppered a plan.
But on that night, 10th of January 1997, Coulton's diabolical plan would become a reality. When it comes to the actual crime itself, what has he done?
Well, a lot of the stuff he'd done beforehand, you know, the device that he created, he had the vehicle stored somewhere else. It wasn't in his name, so he was planning to distance himself from it. On the day in question, he goes to work as normal. He then goes home. We know that his wife works and she finishes at about 10 o'clock at night. So he knew, because we're all creatures of habit, what time she's going to be at work, what time she's going to likely to be leaving. So he knew that between 10 o'clock or just before, he had to be in place. So he's driven the vehicle from the lockup to the venue where she works, placed himself in a position where he could use the remote to switch the engine off. She gets into the vehicle and drives off.
But Patricia only gets as far as the secluded orchard, a few hundred yards away from the care home.
So he would have been within the vicinity of the grounds to be able to then activate that on-off switch and switch the vehicle off. And at that point, he then attacks her and stabs her at least 15 times, as well as batters her across the head with an object, and she would have been dead at that point.
This is a man trusted with a firearm, protecting royalty, and he's obviously an absolute madman.
I don't necessarily agree with you. I think sometimes it's easy to say someone has to be mad for them to come up with such a heinous crime. It's just evil.
As the evidence continued to mount, the detectives found themselves bracing for the daunting responsibility of pressing charges against one of their own fellow officers.
First and foremost, you treat that officer just like a member of the public. You can't have in your mind who is a police officer, so we somehow need to treat them differently. One, the public would not expect that from us, and most police officers accept that. So he would have been treated just like any other person who would come through the door, been arrested for, whether it be a minor or a major offence, he'd have been treated the same way. They would have been disappointed because he's one of their own. So that's the only thing that they would reflect on, is how could that individual who's there to protect and serve can then attack someone so viciously.
And now his time had come. Coulton was charged with his wife Patricia's murder, almost exactly 6 months after he killed her. And in early October 1998, despite continuing to protest his innocence, Michael Coulton went on trial for the murder of his wife at Reading Crown Court.
Protection Squad policeman accused of murdering his wife has begun giving evidence. Michael Coulton told Reading Crown Court how he'd remarried the woman he's charged with murdering.
But I was still left asking myself, what drove this seemingly successful married man and royal police officer to commit such a horrendous crime? Royal Protection Officer Michael Coulton is on trial for the murder of his wife Patricia. The police found his burnt-out car registered under a false name, which contained soil, linking him to the scene of the crime, and the remote control in his garage that they believe was used to stop Patricia's car so he could attack her. At the trial, they were desperately trying to work out why he might commit murder. A question I was hoping psychologist Serena Simmons might have the answer to. When it come to murdering his wife, was he living out a fantasy?
I think that he fantasised about being without his wife. I think he just didn't want her to exist anymore. He didn't want her to be there because he was fearful of rebounding back to her as he had done in the past. I think he fantasised about the life that he could have with the person that he was stalking. And I think he had deep fantasies about the fake relationship that he had with her. So in his mind, he needed to clear the way to get rid of his wife so that he could go and live this other life with this person that he'd been fantasising about for so long.
Would you, in your opinion, say he would have multiple personalities?
I don't think he had multiple personalities at all. I do think he was able to switch his persona and his character on and off depending on what setting he was in. He was possibly a good father because we know that his children, who have very, very sadly been affected by this as well, found it very difficult to give any evidence about their father. So we don't know maybe what he was like in other facets of his life, but we do know that he also held a lot of anger towards his wife, who ended up being the target, really. And that's very much expressed in how he went about killing her, which is incredibly sad.
It was down to detectives to supply the prosecution with evidence that Coulton did indeed commit such a heinous crime. I just don't understand how you go from loving your wife or being with your wife to stabbing her 15 times rather than just saying, this isn't working, we can't be together anymore. How does that happen?
Well, I think in his case it's greed. And bear in mind, she's a mother of 2 children.
Exactly.
But he'd already said previously to a neighbour that if she was dead, I'd have the house, which was worth about $160,000. When you think about it, her being dead gave him an opportunity to have a lot of money.
But that wasn't the only cash Coulton would stand to inherit if Patricia was out of the picture. Can you see any other motive for wanting to kill his wife?
There was some suggestion that she had taken out life insurance, and that was somewhere in the region of about $100,000. So you could say that there was an ulterior motive, that if she died, he would then have that cash for himself and his children. But that's only speculation. That's never been proved as to the reason why. There's nothing to suggest he was in significant financial problems. And that's something the police would have looked at, because they'd have to look at the motive. Is there a financial reason why she's been killed, or is it just because he no longer wants a relationship with her and feels the only way he can get out of it, the sentence, is for her to be killed?
But throughout his trial, Coulton continued to refute the prosecution's evidence and claim his innocence. Why would he plead not guilty? He could have got a shorter sentence if he pleaded guilty.
Most people in that position probably would have, but I think the reason why he hadn't done that is because his children, he knew he couldn't look them in the eye and admit that he'd killed their mother. So the only way he could deal with it is to let the trial run, plead not guilty. If he is found guilty by the jury, he could always say the jury got it wrong, and he could always convince them that it was someone else. He would never have done that. So I believe that's the reason why he didn't take the opportunity to get a lesser sentence by pleading, because he's then admitted that he's killed their mother. So for me, that tells you all you need to know. It's his fear of admitting, I've killed your mother. Imagine you having to tell your child or children that you've killed their mother. But would you bring yourself to do that?
I couldn't bring myself to kill him, but...
Exactly. So there you go.
The trial continued. And to get a better understanding of Patricia's last moments alive, the judge and the jury visited the care home in Berkshire where she was murdered.
This was an extraordinary day out from Reading Crown Court, as a coach arrived with a police escort. The jury had come to relive the last moments in the life of Patricia Coulton. The judge had expressly taken them to the grounds of Linwood Hospital in Sunningdale, where the prosecution alleged the Royal Protection Officer had driven from Buckingham Palace to this field and stabbed his wife 15 times before battering her about the head.
The trial lasted 5 weeks, and the jury took 9.5 hours to reach a unanimous verdict. Guilty.
The Justice Wright sentenced Coulton to life imprisonment, and he told him, the jury have found you guilty of what was quite plainly a long-planned, callous and utterly cold-hearted killing of your wife.
Life imprisonment in this case meant a minimum of 14 years locked up. Is that normal? Seems like not enough. I'm just saying that because if that was my mum, sister, daughter, I'd want him. Life is life.
I totally agree, and the thing is, you know, he's gone to prison, the 2 kids are on their own, and you think, why don't you just divorce her? You didn't need to kill her.
It's so sporadic. Sometimes you hear they get 30 years, or life means life, he'll never come out of prison. He stabbed us 15 times, he's premeditated, he's planned it, he's told people he's going to do it. So it wasn't like he just snapped. Why? What's the difference?
I don't know. And also, I can say after 33 years and dealing with child protection, rapes, murders of kids, and when you see the impact on families, and it doesn't take one life away, it takes everyone's life away, because nothing is the same again.
And that's the truly devastating thing about this case. Patricia Coulton is not the only victim. It's the children who suffer the most, growing up without both their parents and forced to confront the appalling reality that one has killed the other.
I think this has been utterly devastating for the children, and I feel so incredibly sorry for them having to go through this, because not only have they lost their mum, but really they've lost their father as well. Even if you just consider the fact that they have to look at their father and know that he wasn't and isn't the person that they perceived him to be, and that's incredibly difficult for anyone to process. I think, sadly, he wasn't thinking of them in this. This was all very egocentric. It was all about him and his needs. He couldn't deal with real life.
The judge also told Coulton this was an appalling crime, made even more chilling by the fact that he was a police officer.
I would say he abused his knowledge in terms of how the investigators would look at that investigation. So he knew that he couldn't have a vehicle that was registered in his name. He had to find a lockup that he also was not linked to him. He knew that the officers would have examined the vehicle at the scene, so he had the device removed. So those are the things that, from a police knowledge, he was well aware of, and therefore tried to eliminate those bits of evidence to start with. But the investigators are just as shrewd, and they found the relevant bits of forensic, which obviously convicted him, because he did not make a confession.
The case of a trusted police officer committing such a barbaric crime will go down in notoriety.
This must have been a huge case at the time.
It was a scandal. It was such a scandal because this was a man who'd been trusted. I mean, on the very day that he murdered his wife, he'd been working here at Buckingham Palace, he'd been guarding the royal family, guarding the Queen, entrusted with that responsibility. And then he goes home and he stabs his wife 15 times and bludgeons her to death.
Without Michael Coulton admitting to what he has done, we will never know for sure why he did it.
I think how he went about killing his wife is very telling, because the act itself was extremely, extremely violent. I think he was angry with her. He was angry with her for, in his mind, constantly finding her way back into his life, and he blamed her for that. He was very much the kind of person that externalises his problems. The problems he had in his life weren't his, it was because of other people. And so the fact that he was so violent in how he killed her, he didn't stab her once or twice, it was 15 times, and then bludgeoning her to death. So I think he was a very, very angry man, and I think a lot of that anger was sadly directed at his innocent wife.
To me, Michael Coulton loved the thrill of a double life. I mean, there was no love lost for his wife, yet he stayed with her. Why not just walk away, rather than stab an innocent woman to death? I suppose we'll never know.